Hello, welcome back, everyone. So good to see you all. We're going to continue on with our review before the exam. Hopefully, we'll be able to get through all of the questions, whatever was remaining from the study guide. And of course, if we have some time towards the end, then we can probably get to some of the questions apart from that. If you guys have anything that you want to ask, feel free to ask now. So just a quick reminder before we get started, if you could mute your microphones and your video so that there won't be any feedback, that would be great. And we can get started. Okay, so I do have a little bit of a PowerPoint here for our class, and I went through and saw some of the questions that we haven't completed yet, even though it was kind of woven into what we talked about in the previous webinar, but it doesn't hurt to go over things again anyway, because this is for the purpose of review, and it's for the purpose of making sure that you're familiar enough with the material. Also, I've received quite a few questions from you all. And it's so wonderful to see that you're thinking at this level, that you're going one step ahead. But for the exam, it's fairly straightforward. So for instance, if the question asks, what is the relationship of the 5 elements to the doshas, that's all we want. It's, the 3 doshas, vata, pitta, kapha, and which elements are related to those. So vata is space and air, pitta is fire and water, and kapha is water and earth. It's as simple as that. If you wanted to add more explanation to that, feel free to go ahead. But what we're expecting you to know is just that much, because we want to just be able to understand that you were able to get this basic amount of information from the material. If you want to be able to learn more, or you want to put in more details, that's all the better. That's wonderful, but we're not expecting you to put in more than that. Okay, so it's great to see that you guys are thinking at that level, but don't overthink it. It's fairly straightforward, and I'm sure you guys are going to do a wonderful job. Okay, so let's get started. I'm just going to share my screen here with you, and this is just a continuation of the previous PowerPoint that we were doing the last time. Okay. Okay, I guess this started all over again. Okay, so these are the ones that we've already gone through. Just going to skip down to this one over here. So I saw this is basically covering number 3, 4, 5, and 6 in the study guide. And that's in number 3 of the study guide asks, what are the tanmatras? The tanmatras are basically the root energies. Okay, so this chart is also there in your manual. I've just kind of rearranged the order of it a little bit, but it's almost the same, essentially the same table that is there. So this column right here is the tanmatras, or the root energies. These are the 5 elements, which you all, I'm pretty sure you're all very familiar with by now. So we have these 5 elements. We have the root energies, the 5 jnana indriyas, or the sensory organs, the organs through which we gain information. And then we have the motor organs, or the karma indriyas, the organs that actually carry out actions. So the difference between this set is jnana, or the one that through which we are gaining information, as opposed to these organs are the ones that actually carry out action. And here you can see the relationship of how these are related to the 5 elements. Okay, so quickly we'll just go through this, and hopefully if you're able to see it in this order, it should be able to make a little bit more sense, and hopefully it will be a little bit easier for you to remember these names. And of course, if you can't understand or can't memorize the Sanskrit names, that's perfectly fine. It's okay. It can be a bit overwhelming. And it does take a while sometimes to get all of these words. For those of you who have been hearing these words prior to this course, like for instance, you may have heard Shabda, or you may have heard some of these other terms in some of your yoga trainings, then it's all the more easier to apply that right now. But for those of you who may not have come across these terms, it can be a bit overwhelming to memorize. So if you don't get the Sanskrit terms, it's perfectly fine. Okay. There are some that we would really appreciate or encourage you to study, and that's basically the 5 elements, which are the fundamental concepts for understanding Ayurveda. So if you can at least know the 5 elements in the Sanskrit names, that would be really great. Okay. So the 5 elements are, of course, space or akasha, air or vayu, fire or agni, water or apas, earth or prithvi. Okay. And this is in the order of the most subtle to the most gross. And also in this same order, it manifests. And we've talked about this quite a few times in class as well. So if we look at the most subtle of the elements, which is akasha, here, from space, we get sound. So the tanmatra, or the root energy that is exhibited from space, is sound. Because in order to create sound, you need to have space. That's why they say, an empty barrel makes more sound. So in that sense, if there is space in that barrel, it can create sound. It can then vibrate to create sound. So you need to have space in order for sound to manifest. Okay? So there's a relationship between space and sound. Sound is the root energy, which means it's the subtlemost formation or element through which we then require to have an instrument to observe that, or an instrument that is able to then understand what is occurring. So this actually kind of goes back to, if we were to look at it, it kind of goes back to that question of, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? Well, actually it does make a sound. The only thing is, in order for us to perceive that sound, we need to have an instrument to hear that sound. And so that's how you have the instrument here. So the instrument here is your ears. That is that which is able to process the information or the production of sound. Okay, so you have space, which is the substratum for where sound can then be produced. Then you have sound, which is the root energy. And you also have the jnana indriya, or basically the instrument for understanding the information from this particular root energy. Okay? So the instrument here, or the jnana indriya, the sensory organ, is the ears, also known as shrota. So you don't have to know these terms. I just put it in here because just to keep with the consistency of having the option of the Sanskrit terms. But if you are able to just remember that you use your ears to hear sound, that's fairly easy enough and straightforward enough. Okay? So your ears is what helps us to perceive sound. And apart from that, if we look at the motor organ, that this is not necessarily related to sound and ears, but this motor organ is related to space. Okay? So for instance, the organ in your body that is able to create the sound, not just the sound from the external, but the sound from the internal, for you to be able to create and actually do an action. So remember, the main part of these karma indriyas is action. Okay, so the action that is carried out for making sound is your mouth. So that includes not just the mouth, not just the tongue, also the vocal cords. That whole apparatus of making sound is considered as vak. Okay, so that's the karma indriya that's responsible for making sound and has a relationship with the akasha mahabhuta, okay, or the space element. The next is the air element, or vayu. And of course, the root energy for that is touch or sparsha. So for instance, in order for you to perceive touch, it requires some amount of movement. The major quality or the basic quality for vayu is that there is movement, right? So if there is movement, then only you can actually perceive touch. So for instance, if someone touches you, if you touch your skin, that is one movement of actually disturbing the equilibrium of the skin in that area where something comes in contact with it, and so that's how you're able to perceive touch. Similarly, if you are in a place outside and it's very windy, or for instance, in the situation of today where it's very rainy, if it's raining, that's again something that moves and comes in contact with your skin, so that's how you're able to perceive touch. Now, in order to perceive that, you again need an instrument to perceive that motion and that contact that is occurring. And the instrument for that is skin. Okay, so you can see here, there's a nice little equation going on here. You have the elements that produces something to be perceived, and then you have the instrument of perception. Okay, so all three of these things are related to each other. Okay, I kind of sound like a Sesame Street song. Which of these things are related to each other? For those of you who remember back that far. Okay, so we have vayu, which is air. We have the root energy, which is touch. And the sensory organ, or the jnana indriya, is skin, also known as tvak in Sanskrit. Okay, here the motor organ that creates that movement is hands, that actually you're able to do different things with. Your hands, also known as pani. Okay. Next is the fire element. So from the fire element, remember we talked about one of the basic qualities of fire is that it helps us to perceive or to actually visualize things, to process information and understand something. So it kind of enlightens you in order to understand the true nature of something. So that's one of the basic qualities of fire, the Mahabhuta. When it is manifesting as a root energy or as a tanmatra, you get it as in the aspect of a form. So that is rupa. That's the ability to perceive some form, something. Like for instance, you have this is a form, this is a form. It's something that has created its own sort of structure. Okay, so from that form, again, we need an instrument to be able to differentiate or to be able to perceive that. So the instrument that we use to differentiate or perceive different forms is our eyes, also known as chakshu. Okay, so if you have your chakshu or your eyes, then you can tell the difference between this and this. You can see all of these different forms and say, okay, well, this form, it's elongated, it has a point at the end, and it looks like a pen, so which means this must be a pen. And you're able to understand that because using the instrument of your eyes, you're able to look at this form and understand that it's a pen. Okay? Similarly, you use your eyes and you would look at this and see it's a Post-it. And so therefore you understand the form. This form means it's a Post-it. Okay? So you have fire, which transforms into the root energy of form or rupa, and the sensory organ that we use to understand that information is your eyes or chakshu. Also, apart from that, you have the motor organ or the karma indriya, which is carrying out the action, which is your feet. And it's also known as pada. Okay? The next is water or up, also known as jala. And the water element, the root energy for that is taste. Because in order for you to taste something or perceive something, you need to have the presence of water. all tastes manifest through the medium of water. You cannot taste anything without some form of moisture or some form of water, basically, in order to perceive that. So have you ever tried to taste something if your mouth is really dry? Probably not going to be able to taste it. Okay? So that taste is manifested because of the water element. So from this taste, again, the instrument for us to perceive taste is the tongue or jihwa. So that's the place where we're using that instrument or that sensory organ to gain knowledge of different tastes. That is manifested because of the presence or through the presence of water. Does that make sense, or is it a little bit too much? If not, you can it's very easy to just look at one column and study it this way. That should be easy enough, you know. You have your sensory organs, and those are ones you know, your ears, eyes, nose, tongue, and skin. And you have the root energies. What do you perceive with these eyes, ears, tongue, nose, and skin? These are the things that you perceive through that. So that's your root energies. And apart from that, how do these different things manifest? And that you can correlate with the 5 elements, okay? So in whichever way it's easier for you to understand this, you can absolutely study it in that way, okay?
Oh, God.
Okay, so we have the water, taste, and tongue. Next is earth or prithvi. That's the most gross of the elements. And through that, we have the manifestation or the tanmatra of odor or smell, okay? And also known as gandha. And what is the instrument we use to perceive that or to perceive smell? Of course, your nose or the nasa. Okay, so how do we know that odor comes from the earth element? Well, any sort of odor or any sort of fragrance or smell has certain tiny little particles or tiny little microbes that produce different forms of smell. And if we look at the microbes and the tiny little factors that create different odors, they are more gross, because these are things you can actually see, more gross in comparison to the other elements. So in order for it to be divided and to have produced different forms of odors can actually be done with the earth element, okay? So that's why you have earth, the earth element, which manifests different kinds of smells or odors, and it is perceived by the nose. Oh, I forgot here. The motor organ that is associated with water, the motor organ is the urogenitals, which is basically responsible for reproduction, and that's known as upastha. And the motor organ for prithvi is the anus, also known as payu or guda. So you don't necessarily need to know the correlation of the karma indriyas with the elements, but at least if you can just remember those 5 that list separately, that's fine too. Okay, it is good and somewhat logical to be able to figure out these. If you can at least go back in this direction and figure it out, or start from here and figure it out, knowing this relationship is somewhat important. Because for those of you who would like to learn more about, to get into the Ayurvedic health counselor track, this does become an important fact, because this is one of the basic factors when we talk about formation of disease. If there is a change or there is something abnormal in any one of these, then this can be a cause for manifesting changes in these jnana indriyas. So for instance, if you have disorders of the ears or the skin or the eyes or tongue or nose, it can be a reflection of an excess or an imbalance of this, which is basically, again, represented through the doshas. Okay? So this does make sense if you're going into further detail of looking at the Ayurvedic aspect. But if not, if it's just easier to remember just these columns alone, that's fine too. Okay? Okay, so that covers questions number 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay? Next is the number 8. We didn't cover number 8, the Brihatrayas. So I just put these little pictures in here because hopefully that'll be able to be a little bit easier for you to remember. So the 3 major classical texts, also known as Brihatrayas, are the first and foremost, the most ancient or oldest text of Ayurveda is Charaka Samhita. And Charaka Samhita is written by Charaka Acharya. And the time period for that is somewhere around 200 to 300 BC. We're not exactly sure of the exact time because the original text was a different name. The original text was actually Agnivesha Samhita, written by Agnivesha, and then it was redone, sort of edited by Charaka, and he added in some more other chapters and sections, and then it became Charaka Samhita. Okay? But this is the oldest and sort of the primary text for Ayurveda. Okay? So that's the oldest. After that came Sushruta Samhita. The specialty of Charaka Samhita is that it deals more with the conceptual aspects of Ayurveda. It deals a lot with general medicine. There are 8 different branches, and one of the specialities is Charaka really does describe even more to the perspective of general medicine and looking at different diseases and treatments. And he has also described a lot of the philosophy of Ayurveda. In fact, you find a lot of Sankhya concepts that are found in Charaka Samhita. So it's a very large text. This particular cover right here has, I think it's seven volumes, and it has 8 different sections. And in that, they cover different subjects, all different subjects in Ayurveda. So for instance, what you're learning right now, fundamentals, will be covered in Sutrasthana. And then they have anatomy, which is anatomy and physiology, which is in Sharirasthana, and so on and so forth. They have different sections. Okay? The next is Sushruta Samhita, and that is written by Sushruta Acharya. And what is special about this particular textbook, the time period for this is 500 BC. And this particular text is the one that deals with a lot of surgical procedures. So Sushruta in India especially is considered the father of modern day surgery because a lot of the instruments that are still being used till date for surgical procedures, we can find the description and the pictures and the uses of those instruments in Sushruta Samhita. And in fact, some surgical procedures as well. In fact, there was a really lovely documentary done showing that the procedure for rhinoplasty that is followed right now is the same procedure that originated from Sushruta Samhita. So, and this was actually a British documentary that was able to trace it back and found the advancement of the procedures, the surgical procedures described in Sushruta Samhita. Okay? So this text also describes a lot of the fundamentals, and it describes even more detailed anatomy because Sushruta was sort of a very innovative person and a pioneer, where he did dissections of a dead body, and he was able to find out the different anatomical structures and also name that and classify that. So we find much more detailed description of anatomy in Sushruta Samhita compared to Charaka Samhita. Okay, so that's the second one. And after that came Ashtanga Hridaya. So Ashtanga Hridaya, also there's another text that's very similar to this, which is Ashtanga Sangraha. Both are around the same period, and both are basically written, we suspect, by the same author. So Ashtanga Hridaya was written by Vagbhata Acharya, and that time period is around 550 to 600 AD. And in that, again, this particular book, Ashtanga means 8 angas, similar to Ashtanga Yoga. Yoga Darshana has 8 different sections that they talk about, or 8 different levels. And in Ashtanga Hridayam, here also he's talking or describing the 8 branches of Ayurveda. So the one good thing about this text, and this is why a lot of schools and you find a lot of people actually start off mostly with this text here, is because it's done very well. It's sort of a conglomeration of Charaka and Shushruta put together. And what he's done is he's organized it really well. So in that organization, he's able to cover all 8 branches of Ayurveda, and basically describe, again, the fundamentals, the anatomy, physiology, understanding different concepts of disease and treatment, and even other factors like gynecology and obstetrics, pediatrics, rejuvenative therapy, geriatric disorders and geriatric care. All of the different branches of Ayurveda have been described in this book. Okay, so these are the 3 major classical texts, the Brihatrayis in Ayurveda. Okay. So if that question comes up, you just need to know the 3 names. Okay, you don't need to necessarily know what the specialty is, because that comes a lot into the history of Ayurveda. Okay, so next there was define Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. So these are, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas are actually the qualities that we find in the mind. Like, for instance, we talk about the 20 gunas, or the 20 qualities, and those are 20 qualities of the body, and the 20 qualities we find in relation to the food that we eat, or in relation to different activities that we do. But we find these particular qualities, this also can be related to the food that we eat, and we find that subtle nature of how it affects the mind, because these are qualities that can be found in the mind. So sattva is considered the pure nature of the mind, whereas rajas and tamas are considered the doshas of the mind. So for instance, you have vata, pitta, kapha, that are the doshas of the body. Similarly, rajas and tamas are the doshas of the mind, and sattva is the pure nature of the mind. Okay, so what does that mean? Sattva is described as it has these particular characteristics. For instance, a person who is more sattva, or predominantly sattva in nature, tends to prefer cleanliness, has more of a spiritual outlook. They tend to be more virtuous, ethical, noble. These are sort of qualities or characteristics associated with sattva. It tends to be more on the aspect of purity. Okay, rajas is more of a state of inertia, a state of movement, a state of activity and drive and force. So in that, the characteristics that we find when the rajas is very predominant is that the person is quite talkative, not necessarily just talking in general, but excessively. Like, for instance, a person who takes over the conversation, or a person who consistently needs to be the center of attention, who always needs to be the person talking, and it's everyone else is listening to that aspect. Those are typical characteristics of rajas. Also, pride, ego, being very brave, that is also rajasika characteristics. Anger, jealousy, and vanity. So these are things that we can find. It's sometimes they're not necessarily bad, but they are there for a purpose. If used correctly, it can be helpful, but if in excess, it can also cause issues. Okay, and the last is tamas. Tamas is sort of a quality of inactivity or latent state. Okay, and in that you find characteristics such as fear, or ignorance, or grief. Also, you find qualities or activities such as sleep. Tamas tends to induce more amount of sleep, or even laziness. Okay, so if tamas is predominant in someone, you will find these sort of qualities that are more predominant, or it tends to rise more easily. Okay, So this, just to remember, sattva is the pure state or pure nature of someone. Rajas is the quality of activity or activity or drive, and tamas is the state of latent inactivity. Okay. So this is question number 26, which a lot of people had. They had questions about what this means or what this represents. So how do we understand the predominance or the presence of the following gunas in the physical body, in the subtle body, and in food? So the physical body is sort of fairly apparent because that's your physical body. The subtle body, a couple of people were not sure about. The subtle body, remember when we talked about the 24 tattvas of Sankhya, and we talked about what is included in the physical body and what is included in the subtle body. The mind is what is included in the subtle body. From the mind, the ego, the intellect, and prakriti, their primordial nature, all of that is actually in the subtle body. Okay, so for instance, if you want to understand how these qualities are exhibiting in the subtle body, you look for these qualities that are exhibited in the mind, because that's the easiest way to understand it. So ideally, what we're describing here is how do these qualities exhibit in the physical body, in the mind, and also how can you understand these same qualities in your food? Okay, so how do we understand laghu in the physical body? For instance, if laghu guna or lightness is excessive or more predominant, it can actually produce more amount of gas, because gas is again something that is more of space and air, and there is no weight necessarily to it. So lightness can be associated with gas. Or for instance, if a person is fasting, that also induces the light quality in their body. Okay? Similarly, light or laghu guna in the subtle body is, for instance, like if you're doing something like meditation. For instance, if you're doing meditation, your mind feels more active, your mind feels lighter. Like for instance, if you're very stressed out, or you're going through some emotions, or you're going through a difficult time, and if you're able to do meditation, you say, my mind feels lighter now. Or if you talk about it, your mind feels lighter. That is the exhibit of the laghu quality in the mind. So does that kind of make sense now? Okay. And laghu, or the light quality in food, of course, food that are more different types of food that's more airy or space type of qualities. It's more porous in nature. That's what we find laghu in those type of foods. So examples of that is like popcorn or poha. Poha is that flat rice or the puffed rice. Again, it's rice, but there's a lot of porous, more airy quality to it. And so that is an example of laghu quality in food. Or another example is wafers. Wafers tend to be like, the crunchy wafers that it has layers, but there's a lot of space between those layers. Okay. So that because of that, it's more light than heavy. It's very airy in nature. So that is an example of light. Or even like a macaroon. A macaroon is very airy or very light, porous. So that's laghu quality in your food. Okay. And so, for instance, if you consume these type of foods that are laghu quality, it will enhance the laghu quality in your body. And in the sense of, if it is once, then it will enhance just a little bit of the laghu quality in your body. If you're consistently consuming different types of laghu food or light types of food, then it will start to enhance more and more of the laghu quality in your body. And then obviously it can aggravate vata. Okay. And it can also then affect your mind as well. Okay. So next is guru, or the heavy quality. And the heavy quality in the physical body can exhibit, or we can understand that, for instance, if a person has very low energy, or they feel fatigued. You ever notice, like, if you feel really tired or fatigued, you feel like your body is so heavy, like it's dragging. You don't have the energy to move. You don't have the energy to pick up your arms or pick up your legs. It feels like you're kind of just dragging yourself along. Exactly. Those are all synonyms of heavy. So that's how the heavy quality can manifest, or we can understand the heavy quality in the physical body. Another example of that is congestion. For those of you who have congestion or who have ever had it before, which I'm assuming is everyone, you know that when you have congestion, you can actually feel the weight in your face. Or if you have congestion in your chest, you can actually feel the weight of the congestion in your chest. So for instance, like for those of you who've ever had congestion in your chest, you notice when you lie down, the congestion gets worse and you can't breathe. And when you sit up, the congestion is better, because it is so heavy that when you lie down, it actually draws you down, that your lungs are not able to expand because of the sheer weight of the congestion. Okay, again, heavy. Whereas when you sit up, it helps to displace the congestion and allow it to move down a little bit. So it allows for some space for your lungs to expand. That's why you can breathe easier if you sit up as opposed to if you lie down. Okay? So for those of you who've ever had congestion, upper respiratory issues, you know exactly what I mean. And it's the same thing with babies. Like, for instance, when babies have congestion, that's why they tell you to lift the crib a little bit, or put a pillow underneath and let somewhat raise or raise their head, so that it allows the congestion to drain down a little bit. So the heaviness drains down, so it'll allow them to breathe. If not, if they're lying flat, the congestion is too heavy, so it doesn't allow them to breathe easily. Okay? So hopefully that one's pretty clear. Next is, how do we understand the heavy quality in the subtle body, or how do we understand it in the mind? And that a good example again of that is depression. Another example of heavy quality in the subtle body is tamas, which I just explained to you, because that is again a state of inactivity, a state of being suppressed, which is exactly how it happens in depression, how a person feels. They say, I feel blue. I feel like I'm not able to do anything. I'm not interested in anything. I just can't get myself up today. I don't want to go out. I do not want to do anything. I just want to sit and be here. You know, so that again is describing when, and that's an example of an excessive case of the heavy quality. But just so that you understand that this is how we look at these qualities in the subtle body as well, you can understand that. Okay, you can observe that. So the heavy quality in the subtle body, an example is depression. In your food, that's a pretty easy one. So heavy types of food, examples are yogurt, cheese, fried foods. All of these are examples of heavy foods, okay? Or they have that heavy quality. That's what makes them heavy food, because they're heavy to digest. They tend to physically be heavy, okay? So that's what you find, that's the heavy quality in food. Next is the dry or ruksha quality in the physical body. So examples of that is dry skin, of course, cracked heels, cracked lips, which the cracked heels and cracked lips is pretty common in this season, because just as the external environment is drying out, so is our body. It is affecting our body, and our body also tends to dry out. That's the reason why they say that in this season, as the season is changing, whatever is exhibiting or whatever is changing and happening in our external environment, it becomes so predominant or so strong that it can affect those same qualities in your body as well. Okay? So if you are a Vata person, for example, and it is fall now, and it's, say, not today that it's raining, but in another day, 2 days ago, when it was very dry and windy, it's very easy to feel that, you know, your face is getting dried out. You're starting to notice some dry patches here on your elbows. You start to notice more cracks or dryness in your feet, cracked ankles, and of course, dry lips. So cracked lips and dry lips, very common, because it's the dryness in the external environment, the dry in the physical body. And how do we see dry in the mind? Dry in the mind can be understood as a person being very rigid or harsh, okay? Because in the sense that, you ever notice, like, for instance, what happens to a tree when it gets dried out? Exactly right now, it's getting rigid and harsh and somewhat of these jagged edges. Similarly, if this dry quality is predominant in the person's physical body, it can, depending on how long they're exposed to these qualities or how much of dryness is starting to take over in their body, it can also start to affect their mind. And what you'll notice is these sort of qualities will start to enhance. These characteristics will start to enhance. Like, they become more rigid or harsh because of excessive dry qualities in the body and then in the mind. Okay? So examples of food that are dry. And I put baguette in here because baguettes, like, for instance, the really traditional, the very hard, dried baguettes, like, you can knock on it and it's that hard, as well as, you know, if you break it, it's pretty rough as well. That's that type of baguette. I know some other bakeries make baguettes that are a little bit more soft and chewy, but for instance, the dry baguettes will induce more dryness in your body, okay? And the food itself is considered drying in nature. Other examples exactly like that, for instance, toast or croutons. Croutons are a good example of food that is very dry because it has been dried out due to the processing, which is putting it in the oven and drying it out with dry heat. Okay, so you see the level of dryness that we're inducing even in the food. So even our processing can enhance these qualities or actually subside some of these qualities. Okay, that's why cooking is so important. Another example of food that is dry is crackers. Okay, so the next is ushna or hot. So that should be a fairly easy one. In the physical body, it can exhibit as hyperacidity or prickly heat or pimples, or, you know, excessive sweating. All of these are examples of too much of heat in the body, okay? And here I've given you, again, most of these examples are on the excessive side, but just so that you understand that, you know, these are ways we can infer about the presence of these qualities. Similarly, too much of ushna in the mind, you'll find, like, for instance, anger or greed, that can also occur with too much of ushna, okay? Or pride, that you can find with too much of the ushna quality, which is very much related to or associated with the rajas as well, okay? Food, examples of food that are too ushna: vinegar, bell peppers, like all of these different types of bell peppers. They may not necessarily they don't necessarily taste the heat. You don't, if you take out the seeds, or even the seeds definitely have that high hot potency or that high ushna guna. But also after eating, they induce more of heat in your body as well, okay? Examples, again, other examples of hot in food: garlic and ginger, because these all are very hot. Or even like mustard oil. Mustard, another example of hot, okay? So hopefully this now seems to be a little bit more clear. And of course, feel free to use the examples that I put in here, but if you want, you can put in your own examples as well. When you're studying, hopefully that'll bring up some more ideas, and you can put in examples of, like, things that you eat that you think fall under the category of light or heavy or dry or hot, okay? Okay. So hopefully this question 26 is more clear for everyone now. Okay. The next that I have just quickly on my list here. What is the best taste for dental hygiene? That is tiktarasa. Tiktarasa or bitter. Bitter taste tends to be the best for dental hygiene because it actually is great as an antibacterial, antifungal. Um, uh, it fights against parasites and buildup of plaque. Also, what it does is it induces more amount of salivation. So by just inducing salivation, that you never notice, like if you eat something bitter, it makes you kind of cringe a little bit, but it also enhances, like you start to salivate a lot. So that's why this is really good for dental hygiene because it's naturally inducing your and your glands to salivate, which will help to flush out and keep your oral cavity clean. Okay, so that's why tikta rasa or bitter taste is the best taste for dental hygiene. Number 28 was the 7 dhatus. So just in case you guys want to see the pictures, the little pictures that I have here, it might be easier to remember. The 7 dhatus. Okay, so hopefully you all know this by now, but again, here you have a nice little list with some cute little pictures. Okay, so the 7 dhatus are rasa or plasma, rakta or blood, mamsa or muscle tissue, medus is fatty tissue, asti is bony tissue, majja is bone marrow and nervous tissue, and shukra is the reproductive tissue. Okay, so this one would be a good idea if you can memorize the Sanskrit names. Okay, so that's the 7 dhatus. And for 29, it's the number of shrotas. We have 13 different types of shrotas, and they are Annavaha shrotas, which is the one right here, which is the GIT, basically. Pranavaha shrotas, which is basically the channel for respiratory, the respiratory tract. Udakavaha shrotas is the channels for fluid balance in the body. Udaka means water, another synonym for water. So it's the channel that helps or induces the fluid balance in the body, responsible for fluid balance. So you have those extra 3. Then you have all of these 7. So that's a pretty easy way to remember it. Okay. So you have all of these 7. And you have, again, another 3 for the 3 malas, which is Purisha Vahashrotas, which is for Purisha or for fecal matter. Mutra Vahashrotas, which is for urine, because Mutra is urine. So that's the urinary tract or the urinary system, basically. And Sweda Vahashrotas, which is the channels for sweat. Okay, so that's how you have 3 malas, 7 dhatus, and the extra 3 that I told you about, prana, udaka, and anna vahashrotas. Okay, so that makes 13 major shrotases. So, of course, there are extra shrotas in women. There are 3 extra shrotas in women, which is one for Artava Vahashrotas, which is that for female reproduction, and 2 for this Stanya Vahashrotas, which is the lacrimal glands for each breast. So that's 2 plus the Artava Vahashrotas. So these are 3 extra that is there in women. So if, for instance, the question comes up, how many shrotas are there? You can write 13 because that's general for everyone. Okay, and if you want 2 extra, you can write 3 extra for women, but you don't necessarily have to. And if it says name any one of the shrotas, a very easy way is put in any one of the dhatus because there's a shrotas for each one of the dhatus. Okay, so if you remember any of the dhatu names, there you go. If you remember the 3 malas, there you go. Or if you remember prana, which is the respiratory, or anna means food, so that's the gastrointestinal tract, or udaka vahashrotas, which is the fluid, responsible for fluid balance. Okay, so that's the 13 different types of shrotas. So the next is prana, tejas, and ojas define. So prana, tejas, and ojas is basically the most subtle energies that are the subtle energies of the three doshas. Prana is kind of the subtle essence of vata dosha. Tejas is the subtle essence of pitta dosha. And ojas is kind of like the subtle essence of kapha dosha. Okay, and you all have a really wonderful chapter 6, that talks about this. So I would suggest to just briefly go over that. But I think you guys have had a lot of discussion about prana, tejas, and ojas. So hopefully that one is fairly clear for you. Okay. One other question was, what is the difference between pitta and agni? Okay, so the difference between pitta and agni, and I will leave it on here so hopefully you'll be able to see, because this is a nice little track here. So pitta and agni. Pitta is, remember, pitta is a combination of fire and water. So the qualities of pitta is that it is liquid in nature, okay? And it is also snigdha, or slightly unctuous. Remember, that's another quality of pitta because of the fact that it has the water element in it. And also because it is a combination of fire and water, it actually has the tendency to move downwards. Also, again, because of the presence of the water element in pitta. However, Agni does not have the involvement of water. Agni is different because Agni is just fire alone, okay? So Agni has the opposite qualities, actually, of Pitta. It is, instead of being liquid in nature, it's actually dry. So for instance, anybody who knows, if you've seen a campfire or you've seen fire, fire is actually drying. It dries out fluid, right? So Agni itself is actually more drying in nature than Pitta, which is liquid in nature, okay? It is also sukshma, or it's minute, because Agni, or heat, has the ability to penetrate through things, whereas Pitta also has that quality, but it's slower in nature because of the fact that it has the involvement of the water element. And also, I remember I told you Pitta has the tendency to move downward because of the involvement of the water element. Whereas Agni, or fire, rises. Fire has the tendency to move upwards, or to elevate. Okay, so that's an easy way to understand the difference between Pitta and Agni. The simplest way to put it is Pitta has both fire and water, whereas Agni is just fire alone. Okay? Okay. And I think that should be all that I have here. Let me see if I put in anything else. Okay. Someone had asked one question about what happens to the body as the season changes. So this is actually a pretty advanced slide. It has a lot of other factors that we may not have necessarily discussed. But this comes into, for instance, when we look at how our environment, or how factors influence the state of our body, and how it influences whether we get sick or we don't. So for instance, in the summer, it gets really, really hot, okay? And that, for instance, that hot of the summer, you have, in here we're describing as baseline, okay? If you look at this timeline, you can say this is baseline. So for instance, if a person has a Pitta Prakriti, that's their baseline, that's where they start off with. Then you have the seasonal variation of the summertime, that where it does affect the dosha. It starts to feed into naturally causing a rise of the dosha because of similar quality to Pitta, right? So regardless of what your Prakriti is, there will naturally be a rise of Pitta in everyone's body, because of the seasonal factors, because of the external environment. Okay? What makes a difference between how we respond or how that external rise of pitta affects us is what our prakriti or what our baseline is before that starts to happen. So for instance, if you are a pitta prakriti and it's summertime, you naturally will have a higher response to that raise in temperature and the heat compared to somebody who is vata or kapha, because heat tends to pacify vata or kapha. So for a person who is predominantly vata or kapha, even in the summertime, there will be a rise of pitta in their body, but it may not exhibit any signs or symptoms, or if it does, it will be very, very mild. Whereas for a pitta person, in the summertime, that's not their time, because it is, again, same sort of qualities that just increase even further. So they exhibit very high qualities or high reactions to that aggravated pitta. So this is what we had talked about, a prakrita vikriti, or an expected abnormality or an expected disease or expected imbalance of doshas. This is the expectation. If you are a pitta prakriti person, summer is going to be somewhat difficult for you. So you need to make sure that the regimen that you follow is fairly pitta pacifying, very good, strong pitta pacifying regimen. Whereas a person of vata or kapha prakriti, they have to also follow the regimen, but it may not necessarily need to be to the same level as a person of a pitta prakriti person. Okay? So what happens when the season changes now? When the season change, if you don't follow those regimens at the time, okay? If you're not following the seasonal regimen as prescribed to make sure that you keep that rise, that expected rise of the dosha kind of low, then when the season changes, you have that excessive rise of doshas occurring. Okay, that excessive rise of dosha occurs and then it starts to build even more and it manifests as a problem. So that's the reason why when this changes, you have this excessive heat and this drop in cold, an immediate drop in the external temperature. And what that does is that creates, again, further imbalance. So you have this rise of pitta, as well as now you're going to have a slight rise in kapha and vata. You tend to have a little bit of kapha. If you have pre-existing kapha, you will have a tendency of rise of kapha. If you have pre-existing vata, then you feel the vata more. So in this condition, in this situation, now I know this seems like a very complicated answer, but in the reason why we look at that is that you see here, now you end up having a situation where you have two doshas that are aggravated and that are affecting each other, that builds in strength that can then create a problem. And it's not just a slight problem or just a sign or a symptom, but it can develop into becoming an actual disease. Okay? So the main reason we haven't gone into this, because as I mentioned before, this is a very advanced slide right here of what we look at, because we're looking at now disease and how the dosha rise and aggravation or balance of dosha can then start to form or start to create or manifest disease. Okay? That becomes the pathological change of doshas. So in that, what we have described or what you've learned is how to prevent this from even happening. If you follow the seasonal regimens that have been advised, it never gets to the point where it gets aggravated so much that it can become a disease. So you prevent it before it even gets to any of these stages. It'll stop right here. It'll cause a little bit of a rise, And then as you're managing it, when the season change, it automatically goes back down. Okay? So that's ideally what we've been describing so far with you guys, is looking at these factors and how to keep disease at this stage where it never gets a chance to progress to actually become a problem. The dosha, the rise and fall of doshas should still remain at the baseline state and never progress to become stronger and stronger and stronger to get to here. Okay? So that's sort of the simplest way I can answer it without getting into even more advanced track of Ayurvedic pathology. Okay. Okay, so we've been able to go through most of the topics. I think, do we have a question? How does feet relate to fire, form, and eyes? Okay, so we have, the karma indriyas don't necessarily have an exact correlation. That, again, has a very long explanation because it gets into philosophy. So maybe we can explain that relationship another time. But just being able to remember that these are the karma indriyas, or these are the factors in your body that carry out action, that is enough. Since that is there in your textbook, I put it into the table so you can see the relationship, but you don't necessarily have to know that relationship, okay? Because it's a very complicated answer as to how it has that relationship, okay? So if for the purpose of not trying to confuse you more, I'm going to stop it there and not answering it more. Otherwise, that would take another 2 hours to explain. Okay. Okay, so does anyone else have any other questions or anything else you'd like to ask? Because we are at 8, but if there's anything else you want to put out there, maybe I can quickly cover it, or I can send you an email. No? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Anusha.
You're welcome. Hope everyone has a good night. And don't worry, I think you guys are going to be awesome. You're going to do great. And I'm sure that you actually know a lot more than you probably give yourself credit for. Okay? Because I have seen this again and again from whenever we've spent time together. I know you guys are actually taking up the information really well. And so good job and good luck.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.